Hi everyone, and welcome to All the Good Straight Puns Were Taken. We made it to episode 5 without any of us getting exiled from the country, fired from our respective jobs, or hunted through the streets, and we are still on speaking terms. So we are frankly exceeding all of our wildest expectations. I'm going to sidestep the camera and just slide out of it. Sam Lowe, the senior fellow at CER, the Centre for European Reform, and the author of a Substack, Most Favoured Nation. Sam, I understand you had a big announcement last week in terms of your Substack.
Oh, I did. Thank you. Yes. So previously it was fortnightly and free, and now it's still fortnightly and free. But if you want it every week, you can pay me. So you have that option.
Tremendously exciting to be able to get Sam into your inbox with more trade geekery every week. I am a paid up subscriber. Sam can confirm this because he triple checked I didn't somehow steal his money and use it to subscribe. But I use the credit card like a grown up. So that's tremendously exciting, and you should all sign up and get more Sam in your inbox. And with me as well is POLITICOEurope's Anna Isaac. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, nice and sunny here.
Now, I don't know if you guys saw, but over the weekend I ran a poll about what this episode should be about, and the crowd strongly felt that we should just do an hour of jokes about the debate.
I lost you there very slightly, sorry.
Yeah, you cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Perhaps it's MI5 is doing its job. I said that the audience badly wanted us to do an hour of boat jokes, and I was wondering if you've got a boat joke.
Not to hand. I guess I should have one. I just think it's it's funny to throw a yacht into the whole aircraft carrier fricassee.
I'm quite pro boat, so I'm pro all sorts of silly things like this. I'm quite pro bridge. I'm pro tunnel. I'm pro boat, and I'm pro boat because I don't think it's entirely out of the question that I'll be invited onto it, and I think that could be quite fun.
See, I'm definitely coloured by personal experience. So I get terribly seasick, so I think I do have to declare a bias here in my reporting. So the prospect of being invited on it and then having to be with it enough to file a story on board is quite upsetting.
Just to put it out there, if for some reason the UK wanted to renegotiate its EPAs with the CARIFORUM states and they happened to send a trade yacht over, would you say no? I mean,
would it be like hurricane season?
No.
Okay.
Beautiful weather.
Honestly, I think I would, because my former boss negotiated the goods chapter of TPP, and one of the final rounds of that was in Hawaii. And he's like, this is going to be amazing. And then he never saw the beach in a week and a half. They were working 20-hour days. He would see the beach when he walked walked to his hotel from the conference center at 2 a.m. So I just feel like a boat would be, as Anna says, you just seasick and also overworked.
Oh, you've cut out again.
We keep losing you.
Oh. I don't know what's up with my sound today. I'm sure it wasn't that important. For those of you who did badly want more boat analysis, I did an entire bonus episode on the boat where I somehow managed to fill 50 minutes with really detailed analysis. I'm beginning to suspect possibly more analysis than the actual UK government did before doing this. Only Christopher Hope has given this boat more thought than I have after that episode. But it is there, it is up. It is up on the channel. You can have a look if that's your jam. If that's what brings you joy, come and check it out.
If that's what brings you innovative jam. Exactly.
This is the kind of gold Her Majesty's government officials tune into the show for. The second bit of housekeeping is that it turned out that a bunch of people are unable to access Twitch. So the show now has a YouTube channel that'll post all of the episodes for those of you whose workplaces don't want you watching Fortnite and League of Legends at your desks, and are thus suspicious of Twitch. So you can catch all of the episodes, including this one, shortly after it airs on YouTube. And that kind of finishes our housekeeping. And that's Subaya Cades of The Economist deciding to make an entry by just yelling at us. She did promise to heckle. Hi, Subaya.
Amazing.
Well, since there's, since Subaya's here, I suppose we should do some actual substance. And that brings us to why we are all here. All week we have been begging and pleading with people to give a damn about this new draft EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. I don't know if it's a leaked text, I don't know if it's a draft text, I don't know what the status of it is.
Both.
But the EU, we now have an idea of what the EU is picking. And Anna, I wonder if you could maybe just at a high level, before we make Sam break down like quadrennial equations and talk about microeconomics, if you could just set the scene for us. What is the carbon border adjustment mechanism as a principle, and why is it important?
Yeah, so as a lot of developed countries are trying to build up their net zero programs, so they're trying to reduce the amount of carbon their countries consume. They're looking beyond just domestic regulation and tax to work out how they deal with things that businesses and consumers bring in, how they deal with those imports, so that they're giving their producers domestically a level playing field, and they're making sure that they're not just offshoring the problem. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a new concept for trying to deal with this thing, is being thought about by lots of places, which is why the EU's draft text is so interesting, because they're looking at, okay, how do we make this work? They're definitely probably focusing on only a few different industries, different products that are very carbon intensive. And then you could see that being sort of slowly developed and considered as a way to sort of broaden it out. There's already some mechanisms for trading carbon. I think it's useful to know that when you talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, because it might feed into those. So there's an emissions trading scheme. So this is for companies who get a certain allocation of the amount of carbon they're allowed to produce. They're able to trade that as a unit. So there are some sort of existing markets behind this, but this is a very novel idea. People should be quite aware, like people aren't really sure how it will work. People don't really know what will happen if, in some ways, countries believe you're discriminating against them. Because if there's any kind of trade discrimination, then people can try and set up a case against it. So we might see this sort of going to the WTO, being a big argument in global trade about how you make this work. And then you've got people like Sam that are trying to work out, well, okay, this is fair enough when it's other developed economies selling stuff to other developed economies, but what happens when you throw developing nations into the equation? How should they be treated? And I just said the word equation, so it's definitely time to chuck this over to Sam and make it his problem.
So we've been, I think the three of us have been poring over drafts of this thing for a week. And we've kind of prepared some slides that we want to talk you through. And I realize that's not super dynamic and super fun, but genuinely this thing is so hideously complicated, but so important. We couldn't think of any other way to really share it with you. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to pitch a series of questions to Sam and then give you guys stuff to look at other than his facial hair while we do it. And we're basically just going to see how that works out. There's an excellent chance the technology will also break as I do this. So
it's like Chris Whitty. I'm so excited.
Yeah, see.
Exactly like Chris Whitty.
So
let's see if that works. So first, this is the scope of the coverage. This is what this thing initially was supposed to cover. You want to talk us through it, Sam?
Yes, sure. So the idea of this question as to what the scope of the CBAM would be is one that's been lingering for a little while. And by that, I mean, which sectors will this new regulation, and it's a regulation, apply to in respect of imports? And there's some interesting things on here insofar as electricity is there. And my understanding is this is still very much up for discussion, in that there are some member states that really want electricity to be covered, so imported electricity from elsewhere, largely from Russia. And there are some member states who do not, and I'd say that that's probably split along the lines of those who actually have to buy a lot from Russia, or not, because of course it will increase the cost of importing it. And then also some sectors are covered here, so such as fertilizers, but not in its entirety. So it's bits of fertilizer rather than all of it. And there's some things missing. So there's chemicals aren't on there in their entirety. And the reason I say it's missing is all of these sectors are taken from the list of sectors that are covered domestically within the EU by the emissions trading system. And that's important, because from the EU's perspective and from a WTO law perspective, you can only really apply this carbon border adjustment mechanism to imports in respect of sectors that you do apply a carbon price to domestically. So you'll often hear people saying, well, we should apply the carbon border adjustment mechanism to food. And it's like, well, great, but we don't apply a domestic carbon price to food, so that would be a bit too difficult.
So I think that's a really important point to understand, like foundationally. Oh no, we've lost, done something horrible to Anna.
I'm still here, but I look like I haven't moved my face for a
while. Let's see if I can fix that for you.
We're back.
There you go, you're back. So for this foundational principle that you can only equalize at the border, right? Mm-hmm. You can't just penalize polluting industries just kind of cause. You have to sort of, you can only basically punish other countries for not having a carbon tax by pretending that they do.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the exact design of the mechanism in a second, but this has really fed into the discussion internally within the Commission around the design, and in a way has led to it being as convoluted as we're going to see it is, because they have tried to design it as much as possible as an extension of the domestic emissions trading system rather than something unique and new. And when people talk about border carbon adjustments, they're usually talking about, say, they have a domestic carbon tax, and then you'll apply that to imports. It's all very nice and easy, at least in theory. That's not what's happened here. But there is a good reason for it, in that the EU is attempting to ensure that they can justify it as a legitimate extension of domestic measures rather than something arbitrary and discriminatory against importers. And they see this as important because they are probably going to be challenged on this at the WTO at some point.
So thinking about who might challenge them, but also, I guess, who's affected. We've spent a lot of time this week on Twitter and other places telling our predominantly UK audience that they should pay attention to this. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons we've been doing this is some analysis that you did, Sam, that I'm going to try to pull up without breaking absolutely everything. So this is our chart. Talk us through what we're looking at here.
So this is a crude representation of the quantity of imports of products covered by this regulation, or at least the draft regulation. It could change over time, and it gives an idea of exposure to the border carbon adjustment mechanism regulation. And we can see that Russia is really quite exposed. And then I had an inkling. Maybe one of the reasons I did this quite quickly was I had a slight inkling that the UK would be in the top 5, just because of gravity and exposure. And you can just think about some of the things the UK sells to the EU. And so the UK is second in terms of its exposure to this mechanism. And I should clarify that what this doesn't show is that the border carbon adjustment mechanism in its entirety, so the full cost of adjustment, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be applied to all imports from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom does have its own domestic carbon price. But what it does tell us is that there are going to be quite a lot of importers in the EU buying things from the UK who are going to have to, at the very least, jump through quite a few hurdles, unless, and we'll come to this, the UK is deemed exempt from the regulation. And there are some countries that have been listed as already as exempt, so that's Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, so the EEA countries and Switzerland. And the UK, I think, going off this, and Turkey would very much like to find themselves added to that list. And I think the UK probably has quite a good chance of being added to the exempt list if we link up our own domestic emissions trading system with the EU's, which is something that's still under discussion. Turkey less so. We're not going to probably talk about Turkey too much, but in this discussion. But I should emphasise that along with Russia, Turkey are very, very worried about this.
Because I think the way this is supposed to work, right, is that if your country already has a carbon tax, so you are paying somebody either for carbon credits or just a tax on the carbon you consume, then the EU, what the EU's designed is said, oh no, you can kind of subtract that from anything you owe us.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically for the UK, for example, which has an emissions trading scheme, you could imagine a scenario where there are few additional actual carbon credits to pay, but you have to navigate the EU's entire, like, very, very super EU-ish. This is the most EU-ish thing I have ever seen. The most EU bureaucracy imaginable, complete with a new agency and pre-approvals.
Yep.
In order to basically, well, firstly, in order to be eligible to sell them anything, first of all. But then secondly, and I think really importantly, to prove that you are not the most polluting version of your industry anywhere in Europe. So that if in the UK, you'd be paying a carbon price based on how clean your production actually is. If you don't want to pay extra to the EU, you've got to prove to the EU that you're clean. And that's where the fun begins. If they don't create really robust, like these linkages in the way the two systems connect.
Yeah, it's burden of proof. Burden of proof falls on the importer for the most part, and it's not easy to prove it. I mean, it's I love rules of origin. I spend a lot of time just dreaming about them and thinking about them. And this is more complicated. This is harder. And
this is like trying to work out diagonal accumulation while tap dancing backwards, isn't it? It's pretty mega. I tell you one thing I'm so excited for. If this is what the maths looks like for the EU generally, what is it going to look like for Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so this is the one. So I've sort of been teasing this for a little while on Twitter, just saying CBAM in Northern Ireland. But I should emphasise I'm teasing it without any answer whatsoever. I don't actually know how this is going to work, because there's one really easy solution, which is the UK plugs its ETS into the EU's, and all is well, and we never have to worry about it again. But there's in lots of other areas to do with Northern Ireland, these easy solutions exist, and we don't seem to take them.
Well, I was thinking particularly because you've had all these issues around the trade remedies situation to do with steel, and Northern Ireland was left out of some of the quota calculations for steel. So they fell into a bit of a trap there. So I'm thinking if that's a kind of any precedent to go by when steel's going to be one of the industries potentially under this umbrella, it's going to get very dicey very quickly.
Yeah, and Northern Ireland itself, because I did look this bit up in terms of its relation to the EU's emissions trading scheme. Its electricity production is covered by the EU's emissions trading scheme, but everything else is covered by the UK's. But then I have a question, about, okay, so products coming into Northern Ireland are then placed on the EU market for the most part. So you have a circumvention issue, and then there are provisions in the draft proposal that deal with circumvention, which are very much like this is not allowed, and we will make sure it doesn't happen. But I think it gets more complicated than that, and removing all of the politics from it and all of the fact that it impacts real people's lives as an intellectual question, quite fun.
So I ask an interesting question about the list of products. It looked like it sidestepped.
Well, this has always been the plan. Sorry, I didn't mention this earlier. So one of the things that's very interesting about the product list is just who it annoys. In that China is in the top 5, if I recall correctly. Yes, China's in the top 5, but it's not overly exposed, and it's largely exposed on things that the EU applies anti-dumping duties to anyway.
It's used to getting yelled at about steel and aluminum.
Yeah, and the US crawls into the top 10, but it's really not so exposed. And largely what we see is that the impact is on regional supply chains, with a particular focus on countries that the EU doesn't really care if it annoys. and that's interesting from a global political perspective, I think, in that it perhaps help build support for it. It perhaps helps avert a trade war in the first instance. And it maybe shows that the EU is approaching this delicately.
That'd be nice. Maybe before we dive into Northern Ireland, it'd be useful to just we've been scaring people with the specter of this bureaucracy and these formulas. Maybe we just show people what the hell we're talking about here. So this thing.
This is the easy bit.
Yeah, this is the fun bit. This is what you have to do, basically. Sam, I don't know if you want to talk us through that because I'm hidden.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, so prior to importing any of the covered goods, you have to become authorized to do so. You have to apply to the new CBAM authority, which is a new body that doesn't exist yet, but will. And you have to be listed in the CBAM registry as an authorized importer of products covered by the CBAM regulation. And then annually, what's the best way to approach this? Let's just go through it in your spreadsheet sort of way. So you then have to purchase CBAM certificates, which are certificates that are linked to the weekly price of carbon under the emissions trading scheme and will be updated by the EU on a Friday of every week. And you will purchase enough CBAM certificates over the course of the year to cover your annual purchases and imports of products covered by the regulation, and specifically their carbon intensity. And then at the end of every year, which in this case is May the 31st, you will surrender the certificates to in the amount that are proportionate to the total amount of carbon you've imported over the course of the year. You can also, it's not on here, there's other fun sort of technicalities. You can sell back 10% of them, I think.
10% of your previous years.
10% of your previous years. But otherwise, if you don't use them, apart from that 10% you can sell back, you lose them. So then you have to give them all back for free, and then you have to start buying them all over again.
So basically, at the start of a year, you try to work out how much carbon you will effectively need that year to make what you do. And in doing so, and this is where the math comes in, you've kind of got two choices. You can either take the EU default, where the EU's basically said, we're going to set the default level of carbon usage at our 10% worst firms. So if it's a steel firm, we're going to find the the 10th percentile of the worst steel mills anywhere in Europe, and I have no idea where those would be. And we are going to say that is the default. So you can either say, okay, I don't want to do any math. I'm just going to buy certificates and pay for my carbon as if I were that factory, which is like the worst one in Europe. Or you can try to prove
you've cut out.
Or you can try to prove to the European Union that you are better than Hell Factory outside of the volcano. And this is where it kind of gets...
The volcano would probably be not that carbon intensive. I mean, I don't know how
the volcano would be. The factory next to it, maybe not.
Yeah.
So much.
It's renewable, right? Anyway.
Can I make a really, really cheap analogy?
Yes.
It's a bit like paying a lot for an online shop to get premium delivery if you end up not using the delivery. So you get different tiers of delivery. So you can get premium next day delivery, for instance, not to name any names, because you think you're going to need certain products and it might get more expensive depending. Say carbon intensity is the rate of delivery you need. So you might need next day. You might be prepared to wait for a few days. But you have to pay that rate irrespective of whether or not you actually order anything. So it struck me that this kind of pricing model is going to be a bit like that, where people are basically going to have to be like, all right, it's a bit like, I don't know, pricing in a loan, right, to your overall company balance sheet. We're going to be like, I'm going to have to pay this rate of interest whether or not I use this credit facility that I've got. So it's like having to pay a fee to have a current account or a store card on the one hand, and then needing different functions from it as well.
Yeah, although the one caveat I would say is I think it is possible to buy the CBAM certificates a lot as you go. So they have to be surrendered at the end of the year, but you could take it into account on an import basis. And the other caveat I would make is that what you've laid out, Dmitry, is right in terms of the options available to companies. But within the draft regulation, they've also factored in a transition period. So I think it's of 3 years under which the Commission understands that companies aren't going to be able to do this straight away, and that they would provide benchmark prices that are actually less mean. And my sort of view on how you do this, because I'm sort of borderline pro, I'm fairly pro border carbon adjustment just from a political economy point of view, but my sort of view would be that you just do these nice benchmarks anyway, and then you just leave it to the companies that produce it much better to say, well, if you want to get charged less, you can demonstrate it. You don't put a really evil benchmark in. So then the evil benchmark comes later, and then, but to begin with, they'll be a bit nicer to alleviate day one pain.
Do you think that was just in the draft so they could see how people would react to that as a incentive, though?
Well,
being incredibly cynical here.
Well, you never ever know why these things get leaked, and I think that is important to understand, especially in the EU context, in that there have been internal negotiations going on this for a while, and this model of delivering the CBAM is not favoured by everyone within the Commission. There are other models that might be slightly more difficult to justify from a WTO perspective, but would be much easier to run. And that is an ongoing debate. And the thing we should understand as well, so this is going to be proposed officially in the middle of July. And then we're going to get 2 years of arguing between member states and the European Parliament. You know, the European Parliament are going to try to ruin it insofar as to make it, expand it exponentially and ensure that it cannot be justified on any basis whatsoever from an international law perspective. And then the member states are going to sort of argue over specifics. So long way to go. So this draft is the opening gambit, I would say.
So there's a question from Zenoid whether potentially an EU-UK CBAM could like exclude Chinese and Russian steel and aluminum and sort of work with a 232 solution. Sort of two-part question. Maybe I'll do maybe the second half. The concerns the US and Europe and really everyone has about, say, Chinese steel is much more about oversupply than carbon footprint. The Chinese could be producing steel carbon neutrally. The US would still feel like it was being dumped on their market at uncompetitive wages. It's hugely complicated. So I don't think the CBAM alone would work. Maybe, I don't know, Anna, did you have any views on whether they might be able to do something transatlantic, on CBAM generally?
I think if you were going to get an administration that would be keen for it, the Biden administration isn't a bad shout. But I think there'll be a lot more about the need to unilaterally, but sort of in a coordinated way, meet the net zero targets, right? Because countries are meeting them in different ways already under the Paris Climate Agreement, which the US rejoined once Biden took power. So I think there's definitely a chance for international collaboration. Can I see them ever structuring it quite the same way? No, and that's where it's going to get really, really, really thorny when you're trying to work out whether or not, hang on, am I being discriminated against here as a country that's trying to sell into that market is what will constitute a comparative standard, you know. So whether or not you can ever really get something that is exactly the same level for your domestic production as it is when you're trying to treat something at the border. And
the US interaction with this is quite interesting, to being willing to consider it, and some of that seems to be about other politics around the UK-EU relationship. It seems to be that John Kerry's suddenly nice about the CBAM once the EU says it's going to suspend application of some of its further safeguarding duties. But then also the US does have a bit of a problem in that whilst perhaps it would quite like to introduce its own, it doesn't have a domestic carbon price that's applied across the entirety of the US. So what would you measure it against? And it is possible that you could measure it against regulatory costs, but it becomes much more complicated. And there is a slight suspicion that if the US were to go about this, there is some rumblings that the people in favor of doing something similar in the US would do so on the basis of the national security exemption, which creates a whole new barrel of laughs. But yeah, I think if this is to happen, ideally, you'd have UK, US, EU working together. And you can even see with the product list, as we've discussed, it doesn't really hurt the US in the first instance, which leaves that door open. But the US is tricky.
Mm-hmm. I think it will be very hard to not end up in a scenario where countries feel they're being discriminated against. If at any point you get a European politician saying that this is part of the grand enterprise that is strategic autonomy within the EU, and I think it won't be very long before some of this gets talked about as saying like, well, we want to be as green as we possibly can be. So isn't it better to do it in an environment where we can be absolutely sure that production standards are X, labor standards are Y? So it's going to be, you're going to need a lot of active work, I think, to sort of construct this and then sell this as a measure that won't be seen as protectionist.
Yeah, and to add in some countries who are concerned about this, so developing countries, so something I've looked at. And the EU's argument would be, well, actually, look at the product list, look at where we buy these products from. Actually, developing countries aren't very exposed to this anyway. And that's with a caveat that Mozambique is very exposed because of aluminium. So there's one in there, Mozambique's in the top 10. But beyond that, not so much. But then there's a principle issue here, which is that the EU does not intend for this product list to be the end of the story. It very explicitly says that it could be added to. And there's a feeling among developing countries that if the principle isn't established early on, that there should be special conditions attached to imports from developing countries, either exemptions from the measure or reductions, that it could stunt their development unfairly. And the reason they would say it's unfairly is that one of the principles that guides the climate talks internationally, and it's not guides it, it's more that it sort of informs or it has a soft influence over, is this idea that whilst all countries have to contribute to the fight against climate change, some have to contribute more than others because they're more responsible for where we are now. And that's something that developing countries aren't going to let go, even if in the first instance they see, well, it doesn't affect us now, but it could in future, unless we establish something now. And I think, it's interesting there's no waiver for LDCs in there. That's something that could have been there, although it creates some problems around discrimination and most favoured nation type treatment. But it would not surprise me if that discussion builds and builds and we actually see some additional measures included.
Okay. I think that kind of last point, there's a really common misunderstanding of who holds which positions at the WTO and who is kind of concerned about what. And whenever you hear conversations about like raising standards, protecting standards, I think there's a pretty...
Oh, you've cut out.
Come back, Dmitry.
Primarily Western democracies are the ones who are pushing back on that because of corporate influence, when in fact it is overwhelmingly developing countries who are worried about exactly what Sam's describing, which is basically protectionism, wearing green hats, wearing animal rights hats, wearing...
Ooh, you cut out again.
Sorry, I don't know what's happening. If you think about the debate over the UK-Australia FTA, how quickly that went to, we should not be buying from Australia because they are far away, scary carbon, and they are mean to cows. And like Australia's a G20 Western developed nation that's pretty rich. From a developing country perspective, you're like, well, hold on. If your standard is that Australian animal welfare, and like, Australian standards aren't good enough for you, you're going to use this to keep everything we make out, and you're going to do it in a protectionist way. So I think that's a really kind of important point to just describe the lens through which the different sides view these kind of debates at the WTO and elsewhere.
And I should say, though, that from an EU perspective, at least some EU officials, their view is just that this developing country narrative is being pushed by India, cynically, right? So you have lots of perspectives on this.
Special differential treatment is a absolute minefield and a nightmare to navigate on everything, which might be one of the reasons the EU stayed out of this. Mm-hmm. Because as soon as you start saying that some developing countries should be exempt, you've got the least developed country category, which is clean and UN defined, and then you've got a giant gap before you get to like Singapore, South Korea, China, and other, India even, and other wealthy countries, in which you start having to make line ball calls about who is and who isn't.
Oh, cut out again.
It all gets very messy.
Yeah. And I should say that my paper, where I made some suggestions as to how you could deal with those in-between countries, was not received very well. It was sort of like, the enabling clause doesn't expand to this, you idiot, you moron. Why would you suggest this sort of reaction? Which I could understand, but
I thought you had a really interesting point within it, which was that if a country's industry has reached a point where it's globally competitive by a couple of ready measures, like the cost of production, the price of sale, etc. Then you can start to ask the question: okay, you are a developing country, but in this one particular good, you have an industry that's very advanced, because it's not like everyone just all of a sudden their GDP just goes vroom, and everything develops at the same speed across their entire economies. So I think it's a combination that's going to have to be found, in the same way that people are going to, this is very complicated, but people are going to have to find a way to make it work.
Yeah, and I wonder, because so I'm not giving up on this, and I'm going to suggest some other ways of going about it. And one of the other routes towards de facto exempting developing countries is to introduce a de minimis threshold. So imports of below a certain quantity or a certain tonnage of carbon are not impacted by this regulation. Now, of course, an exemption would be cleaner, in that you could just import without even having to worry about the registration and all of that. And so de minimis wouldn't necessarily exempt you from some of the bureaucracy, but because you'd still have to demonstrate how much you'd brought in and the like. But it could help, and it perhaps is cleaner if it applies to everyone, right? So every country in the world could benefit from this de minimis.
So I've got a question from Peter in New Zealand, who's basically asking, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is a fan of CBAM. New Zealand, I think, obviously considers itself a green climate champion. What are the arguments that will resonate with the EU in terms of making this thing sort of open, interchangeable, easily plug and play with something like a New Zealand system, or whatever New Zealand develops? I don't know who wants to take that one.
I mean, so I can start, and it's difficult because if you look at the proposal, there are different ways of ensuring your industry is not impacted by the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. One of them is for your country to be exempt from the regulation, and the EU has retained the ability to extend that treatment to other countries beyond Switzerland and the EEA countries who have the same regulatory approach and are part of the EU's emissions trading system. But to my mind, when I look at that, it looks like it's very prescriptive, in that it sort of says you should have an emissions trading system and it should plug into ours, or at least something like that.
That doesn't sound like the European Union, Sam.
No, I know. And my view on this, which will be ignored, is that actually an effective equivalence regime could allow for differentiation in approach, in that countries should be able to say, look, we've approached this slightly differently, but we have pretty much the same cost being applied to our industries. Could we be exempt on that basis? But that doesn't seem to be the approach the EU is taking, in that for those sorts of instances, so whereby a country does apply its own carbon cost and that does impact on their own domestic producers, it seems like that will be taken into account via the equation that Dmitry is going to pull up soon, and industries will the industry itself will have to make that case via its submissions, which is it's not as clean. It still comes with quite a lot of paperwork and bureaucracy.
Do you think if they get enough political consensus in the EU, though, you might reach a point where they go, okay, let's try and think about ways to make this more bespoke, and because they'll want that Brussels effect, right? So the idea is you want to pull people into your regulatory orbit, because that's a fantastic source of soft power that a lot of people in the EU who write policy are very proud of.
But that's the strategic argument that is consistently ignored in the EU's approach to equivalence in other sectors. So if you think about financial services and you think about data adequacy, you could potentially argue, even on data, for example, that the Commission actually views it as quite a strategic tool and would like to extend adequacy elsewhere. It brings people into the EU sort of orbit. But the Parliament just goes, privacy, 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 strike that down, get rid of that. We're worried about the UK, we're worried about Japan, we're worried about... So it becomes quite tricky, and my fear is that sort of inward-looking discussion will win out. And the thing about the Brussels effect is that it's largely happened so far without the EU trying. right? It's been convergence due to market size rather than convergence due to specific agreements and structures. And I think that perhaps for the Brussels effect to continue growing, they will need to actually think more strategically about their agreements. And I would hope they would here. My lingering concern is that it will just get caught up in the internal politics. Oh, and we should say it's the internal politics of 27 countries. They've already got quite a few countries to worry about before thinking beyond that.
So if I could kind of to play devil's advocate to that EU not being strategic approach, the way this seems to be structured in terms of not just waivers or exemptions, but even linkages, and even down to the level of individual sort of approvals for verifiers and for installations and for importers, is very much the Commission giveth and the Commission taketh away. Now, I'm not suggesting, they're maliciously setting up this power dynamic, but you basically do get a Switzerland situation. The EU has the ability to effectively cancel people's participation in the easy parts of the scheme, and in this scheme, entirely off their own back, entirely off their own discretion, with an internal appeal system. And the way that they have designed it is they can hold up participation as a carrot in terms of, if you're this good, we'll give you a linkage. But if you're really nice to us, if you really embrace the Brussels effect, if you really bring on board more of our values trade-wise or climate-wise or what have you, we can give you an exemption. And so they potentially, there is, I think, some strategic argument to be made for it.
But I think that's the Commission's plan. I think the Commission's intention is as you've laid out. I just think the Member States and Parliament might ruin it.
We would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you pesky democracy.
Exactly, yeah.
We've got a question from MP Rivers asking basically about whether given that the EUA price has gone to 50 euro, aren't non-EU entities going to hedge their risk by buying EUA futures? And if so, won't that just raise the price? My understanding is that won't work because the certificates are not themselves EU carbon credits. They're linked to they're like part of, but you can't buy a bunch of EUA futures, I guess, to then trade them later in order to hedge your uncertainty. That's my very limited understanding of how this works.
They expire at the end of every year.
Yeah, but they're not the same as an EUA future.
They're different. They're a CBAM certificate.
Right. Speaking of, I guess we should, since we have these horrific slides, we should make Sam talk about them. And I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got Chad and Samaya at least like two economists at least on the call who actually understand this stuff, but I don't. Let's see if that works. This is our calculating embedded emissions. These are the options that you have as a UK business after this thing goes in, if you make one of the covered products. Sam, what are we looking at?
So on the left, it's the default method you discussed earlier, where you can't be bothered to do all of those equations, so you just pay whatever price the Commission tells you, and it happens to be the carbon cost that would have applied to the pretty much worst emitters in the European Union. So it's quite punitive. And then on the right, you just have some mad equations, and you're going to have to, if you want to claim that you've actually, you want to demonstrate the real amount of carbon that has been embedded in your import, you have to be able to read this equation and work out what it means. And by that, I mean pay someone to do it for you and to sign it off. And, lots of letters and numbers and things.
Look, this is the kind of
this is the simple one
analysis. This is the simple one. This is the simple formula.
I was just thinking that.
The complex formula is this formula. So the base formula plus basically the emissions of your component parts. So in addition to running that equation, you kind of have to run the equation for everything that went into your good in terms of like component bits, and then add that in.
And we should say that so if you go back to the equation before,
Yep.
So each element of this, so you've labelled them, so direct emissions, emissions from imported heat, emissions from exported heat. Each aspect of this requires quite a lot of analysis and quite a lot of knowledge about your supply chain. So just compiling the individual factors could be quite complicated. And of course, it'll depend on the product. Some products will be easier to do this for than others. But yeah, it's a bit rough, and it's why the Commission is going to, in the first 3 years or so, just give people a nice benchmark they can use if they're not going to be able to get up to speed on this. But then, as you've sort of alluded to, there's going to be this whole process of third-party certification. So the fact that you're going to demonstrate this, and it's going to have to be signed off by a third party, and to which I say we should all work out how to do these equations, because money.
Yeah, if you are in the audience and you understood a single word of those slides, then just go and retrain to start like working out these equations now, because you'll be making bank like 4 years from now.
A bit of a counter to this being awful bureaucracy. Don't you think companies are going to have to do this with their supply chains anyway pretty soon?
It's a good counter.
Yeah.
Because of net zero targets.
And that would be the EU argument. And also the EU argument is that, well, we're asking our domestic producers to do this effectively. I mean, they're not, right? Because they sort of are. Yeah, so they are. Yeah, so they could maybe argue that they're only asking for importers what they ask of domestic people. And yeah, maybe this is the future anyway, as you said.
Well, I think that there's kind of a couple of points to that. I think one of the reasons that formula looks as horrific as it does is because the EU's doing something quite brave, which is they are trying to measure not just carbon, but embedded carbon. So it is not just the carbon that went into the final stage of assembly. It's not just what it took to finally make the steel. It's kind of everything that went into it before that step as well, which is hideously complicated, but is always going to be hideously complicated when you try to basically track the carbon footprint of a supply chain. And if you don't do it, there's always a risk you're going to get circumvention. And you're going to have people basically do import kind of components and do final assembly and find all sorts of ways around it to shift it. So that's kind of another, I guess, counter argument, which is if you are going to do this brave thing, then unless you go for Sam's benchmark approach, if you want to...
Oh.
Cut out.
We'll never know if you want to.
You cut out, Dmitry.
Back again.
There you go. So cut the swearing, which really captures the mood of the episode. If you want to capture how green production actually is for most firms using this system, you've got to do something horrific, or at least visually horrific.
Well, and the counter argument against my benchmarking approach, which is so if people have only just tuned in, my preferred approach to this would be that you had a external benchmark for each product that was assessed against the average cost of producing the equivalent product domestically over the course of, say, a year, right? And the EU said that's what the EU will probably do for the first 3 years, but after that, it's got this sort of horrendous, you're going to pay the worst of us, our producers would have to pay. And the problem with my benchmark approach is that there isn't so much of an incentive to actually demonstrate the real amount of carbon that's being produced throughout your supply chain, because if the benchmark is tolerable and you think it's not going to be, there's no actual benefit from demonstrating the real carbon intensity, then you won't do it. And this is why the EU, I think, and Dmitry and I were talking about this earlier, this is one of the reasons the EU has made the default so bad, because it wants companies to look at that and go, okay, that's going to be really expensive. So it's going to be less expensive for us to go through this slightly arduous process and demonstrate the real emissions.
at the risk of getting Sam all hot and bothered, the best analogy here is kind of rules of origin and preference utilization.
Yep.
What they've basically done is at the border, you get a choice. You can do the easy thing and then pay more by going with the default, or you can do the arduous thing and either do all of your rules paperwork, or in this case, do all of this prove that you are wholly emissions stuff, in order to pay less. And basically firms will have to make that decision on a case by case basis. Really, if you think about who this screws hardest, if it must screw, then onto whom is the screwing? Then you've kind of got to picture a small and medium enterprise that is produced.
Oh, you cut out again.
I think he's just getting censored by the Swiss government now.
So an SME that produces this stuff really, really cleanly in not very large volumes outside of the EU. Because they will be the ones who are punished the hardest by the difference between what they do and the default. And they also have the smallest economies of scale to justify paying Chad to model their carbon emissions down to the gram.
But I wonder, sorry, Anna, you go.
I'm just saying that's any small business's experience of any kind of trade agreement that's ever existed in the modern era, though, isn't it, to a very large extent?
Yeah, but I think if
built
they
on
are
economies of scale, that's what makes these work. Going through those, it's very difficult if you're a specialized small business with a small unit value. It's hard.
But I do think that there are measures that could be taken to mitigate this problem for smaller businesses. And I think that this could exist already in rules of origin, for example, but it doesn't for the most part, which is that for certain industries of a certain size, the Commission or the CBAM authority could actually take on the cost of the administrative burden of demonstrating the quantity of carbon you have embedded in your import. So you could go to them and say, okay, we're an SME as per your definitions. Provide us with some resource, people, time to help work this out. And that's what I do, right? Because you want people to comply, you want it to be done well, but you also don't want to just punitively penalize small companies who are trying to get by. And my, this is building on something that I think should exist for rules of origin in general and would help with preference utilization rates, because, it's a big issue there as well. So I think if you're approaching this sensibly, you can resolve that problem to the extent that, say, for example, these sort of schemes do exist for GBNI trade at the moment, right? And they're not perfect. There's still going to be some problems, but the government can take on some of this burden if it wants to.
Yeah. Although I'm sure the British government would love to have 3 years of as a transition period.
I don't think they need it.
Transition periods are unnecessary.
And a subversion of democracy. But actually, there is something of a Brexit angle to this. I've now started looking at the mic thing to see when it drops out. There is a Brexit angle to this in a way, in that the most likely landing zone looks to be a linkage rather than exemption at the moment. And so you are going to get this system where, just like in the TCA, the UK-EU Free Trade Agreement, British firms aren't necessarily paying any more, but they are having to do a bunch more bureaucracy.
Or the buyers are, right?
Yeah. Fundamentally, if it decreases their competitiveness. I know Chad's about to kick my door in and say importers pay tariffs, and he's right, of course, but
this is also another interesting one where there's so same with rules of origin, there's an asymmetry when it comes to enforcement, in that the importer will be required to provide the information necessary to the CBAM authority, but they will be reliant on the exporter being able to provide them with that necessary information, right? Because they're the ones who know about their supply chain, which is why the Commission suggesting this scheme of third-party auditing and the like, because the importer otherwise would just be taking at face value what the exporter tells them. This is the rules of origin problem again, right? The exporter tells you everything's fine, but if everything turns out not to be fine, it's the importer that gets slapped.
Yeah.
So, fun.
And the Commission reserves the right to slap you for up to 4 years by kind of spot auditing these documents, which is fun.
I mean, how do you even go about auditing some of this stuff, right? You're going to be sending people out to. Are you going to be sending them out with CO2 monitors, outside of the chimneys? I'm not sure. I'm sure
they already do that. So I think we're underestimating how some parts of this are built on existing mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
But also why that equation looks like that is because each one of these is a circumvention route that a business has already magically come up with as very very good ideas. So what you have is a list of very good ideas for how to avoid something like this. So I think it's a sort of a problem of combined ingenuity over years, amalgamating into one sum.
So speaking of amalgamation, every time we promise people that we will do more than one thing on this show, we end up talking about one thing.
No, Dmitry.
No.
Oh,
just doesn't feel like I should ever speak to you, because we find ourselves fascinating. But I do wonder, Anna, we don't have time for a proper discussion, but since the people were promised, could you give us a 5-minute summary of the G7 outcome on tax?
Sure. So Janet Yellen, not content with being at the helm of the Federal Reserve for many years and wielding considerable clout there, has now moved into, in her government role, in the Biden administration role she has been, along with G7 partners, trying to work out how you deal with corporate tax. It's a pretty sticky issue for America. It's obviously home to a lot of the big tech companies that we know have a troublesome relationship with tax. And so all of these countries are trying to work out how, going forward, can we come up with something that's a bit more akin to a level playing field, so that you don't aggressively incentivize companies to come up with clever ways to incorporate themselves somewhere else. That means that they can, dare I say, Ireland, you can avoid different forms of corporate tax. Or you had an example recently with Microsoft, who had billions of pounds, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of earnings, but it had a subsidiary, an arm of its company that was registered as resident in Bermuda for tax purposes. And so it paid hundreds of millions of pounds on hundreds of billions of profit. So they're trying to come up with a solution. The one that's been put forward and has got quite far with the G7 group of economies is a 15% rate. That's quite low compared to the average corporate tax rate for the G7. So to use the UK as an example, UK corporate tax is 18% now. It's meant to go up to 25% in 2025, which is a bit closer to countries like France, which is about 28% now. But the idea is that you have to sort of start relatively low, because this has to go beyond the G7. This has to go to the G20 and beyond, to the OECD, where you've got around, I think it's about 139 members, all trying to come to an agreement on global tax. So they've gone with 15%. It's still pretty mega that they've agreed that together. Now it's got to go onward to the G20, and that's where things will get a bit stickier when you have got countries who are smaller. They might not have, a ready alternative economic option that doesn't rely on these clever corporate structures, these clever tax incentives for corporates. So it's going to get pretty controversial. Like with anything, when you try and sort of do the right thing on a global level, you can end up, doing over smaller economies that are trying to specialize in something to get by. But it's a pretty big step, and it's certainly going to try and offer America a way to say, can we just back off big tech a wee bit, because we're trying to make everything a little bit more equal in a world where it's very difficult to marry up, again, your domestic tax regime with your neighbor's tax regime and the global tax regime. So in some ways, they're kind of the tax narrative, the carbon narrative are getting pretty similar. And it's definitely the symptom of globalization, where everything will flow a bit like water until you find a way to sort of make sure that people are on a level pitch. So that's the aim of the G7 breakthrough on tax that they agreed at the weekend.
And that is global taxation in 3.5 minutes with Anna Isaac. Before we go, I did want to deal with Vas's question, Vampa, in basically asks, have we talked about how you design a carbon border adjustment tax that's WTO compatible, given that you would be effectively discriminating at the border? I can give my 2 cents, which is that firstly, they are definitely going to get sued. There is no version where nobody takes a dispute against this thing at some point. But that doesn't mean it can't stand up to it. Provided you are super clean about applying it to everyone and making it really difficult to prove that you are charging people more than your own companies would pay in carbon tax, you've got at least something that your very expensive lawyers can defend for 2.5 years, assuming there is a court to defend it in, which is a question mark. So Balls again, asks if they sell a lump of coal, how would the CO2 be calculated? So in this case, there is no downstream impact calculation. So, for example, if the CBAM applied to a car, you wouldn't calculate the emissions of the car on the road. You would just calculate the carbon price of making a car plus all of its components. So the answer would be however much CO2 it took to produce that lump of coal. Not that lump of coal, I think, isn't covered by CBAM so far, but hypothetically that's what it would work. But I have to get these guys out of here. We are already 1 minute late. So let me quickly just plug their links and Substacks, and then we shall thank you all and let them go. With me, as always, I had Anna Isaac, the UK Trade and Economics correspondent of POLITICOEurope. She tweets at Anna Isaac, and she writes POLITICOEU's Morning Trade UK newsletter. And we had Sam Lowe, the Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform. He's on Twitter at Samuel Mark Lowe, and he's the author of the weekly if you pay him, bi-weekly if you don't, or fortnightly if you don't, Most Favoured Nation Substack. And I am Dmitry Grozoubinski. I'm on Twitter at Dmitry Opines, and I run ExplainTrade. So thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you to my lovely co-host for popping in and putting up with my mic deciding I should be silenced roughly every 30 seconds. And I hope to see you guys all next time. Thanks so much.